much, much more. So please give a warm welcome to tonight's artist, JAMB.
so much, and thank you so much for coming to hear us this evening. It's great to see so many people here. We're thrilled. As it says, we are JAMB, which stands for Jim, and April over there, and Mark is me, and this is Bob. And it made a nice name, but my niece has a better name for us. She calls us April and the Cue Balls. Maybe we'll sell more records. I met Ray Pizzi in 1965. Some of you remember 1965, not too many. I was going into the 7th grade in North Junior High School in Randolph, Massachusetts, and Ray had just graduated from the Berklee College of Music and was in his first year of teaching in Randolph. He was my band director in junior high. Yeah, in 1969, he left Randolph, Massachusetts, if you can imagine anybody, and moved to LA, where he spent the next half century being one of the greatest, most successful studio musicians, jazz musicians, made many albums under his own name, traveled all over the world. If you watch television, if you went to the movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right into the 2000s, you heard Ray. You heard him a lot. He's on everything. And he is kind of one of the founders of jazz bassoons, which obviously has become very, very hot. When I moved to San Diego about 8 years ago, you know, we had been out of touch for decades, and I found his website and got in touch, and he remembered me, and one thing led to another, and he sent me a bass clarinet quartet that somebody had asked him to write to try. And it just so happened I had some friends who have bass clarinets. So we played it, we recorded it and sent it to him, and the floodgates opened. We've got about 30 pieces now. Original pieces. Well, some original Pizzi compositions and some, like the next one, arranged by Ray. And this one, wonderful song called Joy Spring by Clifford Brown, features Big Bottom Bob Zelickman. Ray calls him that, because he plays the bottom stuff. And he does it big, but not on this one. All right, that's enough from me.
Okay,
Make it go.
we're gonna make it go. Question? What was that one called? That was wonderful.
That was called Da Blues.
Okay, thank you.
An original Pizzi composition, as is the next one. And this one, in fact, is the first one, the one I mentioned before. It is called Doofus. These are premium seats, huh? You paid extra to get clarinet spit on you.
So the next piece we're going to do is a Beatles song called When I'm 64.
It was released as a single in 1967, but it was written in '66, so it makes it 50 years old this year. And in fact, it was the B side. The A side was "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." And but this piece, of all the pieces of Beatles songs, actually had a clarinet trio in it. It had 2 clarinets and a bass clarinet in the piece. The 5th Beatle, George Martin, who was the producer, wrote and scored the clarinets for the piece. When I told my good friend Fred Ubaldo Jr., who you might know is a great bass player in town, about our group, all of a sudden this showed up on my mail one day. So this is from Fred, when I'm 64. We're going to play a group of pieces now written for the more standard instrumentation for clarinet quartet, which is 3 B-flat clarinets and a bass. So just take us a moment to get our chairs set up here.
Not sure where we're sitting for this because these are much lighter than these.
Well, Bob goes to town. He really goes to town. This was actually short. I love this piece by Alec Templeton. I used to listen to this this song all the time when I was in school. I listened. Benny Goodman made a recording of this, and I like to listen to it. It's both jazz or swing and Bach in the style of the music. And in the second movement, the fugue, it has everything in there. It's a fugue. One instrument comes in at a time, and even in the end, there's a stretto. Anybody know that? No? Well, you can take a class with me later, okay? Okay, I'll just tell you, a stretto, you know, I just told you that the entrances come in one at a time in the beginning. Okay, in the end, a stretto is the entrances doesn't wait for the first person to finish, it comes in earlier, you know? And so the entrances don't wait for the thing to finish, they come on top of it, they have the next one. So you'll hear that too. Okay. That wasn't it.
next piece is the flower duet from the opera Lot Maid by David.
called In Autumn, but we played it in spring. It's a perfect example about how the person who starts should know what the tempo is. I apparently missed that day at music school. You know who Johann Strauss Jr. is, right? He is the waltz king. He wrote Blue Danube and all these great waltzes, and we are not going to play it. This is called the Trish Trash Polka. About 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll be back with more.